Having covered some of that additional material on ligaments and cartilage, we can now start thinking about injuries. And in this video, I want to start with acute injuries. Right, so these are things that happen very suddenly. Maybe you get tackled, maybe you fall, maybe you roll your ankle. So let's think about, from a mechanical perspective, what an acute injury looks like. So let's look at maybe what happens when you roll your ankle. Let's say you're playing basketball and you land on somebody else's foot like this, and your ankle suddenly everts like this. Let's draw a stress strain diagram and think about what's going to happen. So we've got strain, then stress. Again, that's going to be the force applied divided by the force applied to, let's say, one of these ligaments out here on the outside of your foot, divided by the cross-sectional area. So maybe if you zoomed in, there's some ligament going like this. And we're interested in that cross-sectional area right there. So whatever force is pulling on this ligament from the foot rolling out like that, we're going to divide that force by this cross-sectional area. So what do we know about ligaments? There's going to be a little bit of a toe region, and since this is presumably a large, high magnitude, high rate of loading force, we'll probably see a fairly steep ramp up. This is, of course, all happening in milliseconds. And then if there's enough force, we'll get into beyond the linear region. We'll start getting into the plastic region of the material. And as I mentioned in the last video, if we could zoom in on the collagen fibers in this ligament, this part of the stress strain curve, they would be just stretching out, not being damaged at all. But once we get into that plastic region, that's when things start to deform. So we get maybe that one breaks, and then maybe that one breaks, and a little later that one breaks, and that one breaks. And if this load keeps accumulating, what's eventually going to happen is we'll reach the ultimate strength, and then maybe it'll just pop right away, or maybe it'll stretch out even more and then break. And that's, of course, when you just get a complete tear. So there's different grades of ankle sprains, and I won't go into detail on what those are. There's similar categorization schemes for things like muscle strains and tendon injuries and various different types of acute injuries. And they generally have to do with, did you sustain some damage, or did you completely shear off and rupture that tendon or that ligament? So acute injuries are pretty straightforward, and we can maybe think about what kind of structures we typically see these at. So ankle sprains and ankle ligament tears being a classic example. Another one you're probably familiar with is the various ligaments of the knee, ACL, MCL. Patellar tendon can rupture. You can get Achilles tendon ruptures. Those are relatively common. Biceps tendons sometimes, like right here, sometimes people rupture that. These acute injuries seem to be a little bit less common in the upper body, probably because the load is generally smaller in the upper body, for most sports at least. Had a friend who tore his pectoral muscle off his rib cage. That would be tearing right here. So various areas that you can get an acute injury. Another one is, and maybe another good exercise to think about is what happens with bone. So let's maybe think about you're getting, tackled from like right there, and we can make a stress strain curve for bone, the tibia. And same thing, that stress will be force divided by cross-sectional area. In that case, we care about the cross-sectional area of the bone. And what's going to happen? Well, no toe region, remember, because bone doesn't have a toe region. And bone not so viscoelastic, so it's just going to be more of this rigid behavior. So this linear region, everything's fine, but something you quite often see with bone is that you get a tiny bit of a plastic region, and it just breaks right away. So that would be a bone fracture, right? So stress goes up, 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 and then the bone just completely fractures. Now, something that's good to be aware of is that you can get this happening with a stress fracture as well. And the reason that happens with a stress fracture, and by this happening, I mean you can get a full-on complete bone fracture if, say, you continue training on a tibial stress fracture or on a metatarsal stress fracture. And the reason this happens is because the mechanical properties of the material degrade over time, which we'll go into much more detail on how that happens. But if you have a stronger bone, your stress strain curve might look like this, right? Both steeper, so more stiffness, and higher ultimate strength. And if you have a weaker bone, so say you have osteoporosis, stress strain curve might look like that. So it's important to remember that both the force, which is going to dictate the stress. So, well, let's think about what matters here. So what matters? Number one, the force, because that's going to go into that stress equals force divided by cross-sectional area. Number two, area, cross-sectional area. So somebody with big, thick bones is going to be much more impervious to acute injury than somebody with skinny, little, thin bones. And three, let's say the material properties of the tissue. So that's like this versus this, right? Because we're plotting this on stress, you could also have the same material properties, but if say the cross-sectional area is bigger, even then you're still in a better situation. So these are the three factors that are going to determine how your body can handle a sudden load, such as rolling your ankle, such as getting tackled, such as landing from a really high height, such as like a car accident, something like that. So acute injuries are pretty straightforward because we just have to think about essentially going up the stress strain curve one time. And the question is just, do we get all the way up to this point or not? Do we get up into this plastic region where we're going to be doing permanent damage to the tissue? And if we do we get all the way to the failure? Which that would be a complete rupture, a complete fracture of the bone. Whereas plastic region, like we said earlier, that's like what we would colloquially call a ligament strain as opposed to a ligament rupture. So that's acute injuries. And in the next video, we'll talk about overuse injuries and how those are different.